106. Vivisection. This first appeared as a pamphlet from the New England Anti-Vivisection Society, Boston, 1947, and was reprinted in England by the National Anti-Vivisection Society in 1948. It was then reprinted in Undeceptions, 1971, and First and Second Things, 1985, and is now in Compelling Reason, 1998. It is the rarest thing in the world to hear a rational discussion of vivisection. Those who disapprove of it are commonly accused of sentimentality, and very often their arguments justify the accusation. They paint pictures of pretty little dogs on dissecting tables. But the other side lie open to exactly the same charge. They also often defend the practice by drawing pictures of suffering women and children, whose pain can be relieved, we are assured, only by the fruits of vivisection. The one appeal, quite as clearly as the other, is addressed to emotion, to the particular emotion we call pity. And neither appeal proves anything. If the thing is right, and if right at all it is a duty, then pity for the animal is one of the temptations we must resist in order to perform that duty. If the thing is wrong, then pity for human suffering is precisely the temptation which will most probably lure us into doing that wrong thing. But the real question, whether it is right or wrong, remains meanwhile just where it was. A rational discussion of this subject begins by inquiring whether pain is or is not an evil. If it is not, then the case against vivisection falls. But then so does the case for vivisection. If it is not defended on the ground that it reduces human suffering, on what ground can it be defended? And if pain is not an evil, why should human suffering be reduced? We must therefore assume as a basis for the whole discussion that pain is an evil. Otherwise there is nothing to be discussed. And now, if pain is an evil, then the infliction of pain, considered in itself, must clearly be an evil act. But there are such things as necessary evils. Some acts which would be bad simply in themselves may be excusable and even laudable when they are necessary means to a greater good. In saying that the infliction of pain simply in itself is bad, we are not saying that pain ought never to be inflicted. Most of us think that it can rightly be inflicted for a good purpose, as in dentistry, or just and reformatory punishment. The point is that it always requires justification. On the man whom we find inflicting pain rests the burden of showing why an act, which in itself would be simply bad, is, in those particular circumstances, good. If we find a man giving pleasure, it is for us to prove, if we criticize him, that his action is wrong. But if we find a man inflicting pain, it is for him to prove that his action is right. If he cannot, he is a wicked man. Now, vivisection can only be defended by showing it to be right that one species should suffer in order that another species should be happier. And here we come to the parting of the ways. The Christian defender and the ordinary scientific, i.e. naturalistic, defender of vivisection have to take quite different lines. The Christian defender, especially in the Latin countries, is very apt to say that we are entitled to do anything we please to animals because they have no souls. But what does this mean? If it means that animals have no consciousness, then how is this known? They certainly behave as if they had, or at least the higher animals do. I myself am inclined to think that far fewer animals than is supposed have what we should recognize as consciousness. But that is only an opinion. Unless we know on other grounds that vivisection is right, we must not take the moral risk of tormenting them on a mere opinion. On the other hand, the statement that they have no souls may mean that they have no moral responsibilities and are not immortal. But the absence of soul, in that sense, makes the infliction of pain upon them not easier but harder to justify. For it means that animals cannot deserve pain, nor profit morally by the discipline of pain, nor be recompensed by happiness in another life for suffering in this. Thus all the factors which render pain more tolerable or make it less totally evil in the case of human beings will be lacking in the beasts. Soullessness, in so far as it is relevant to the question at all, is an argument against vivisection. The only rational line for the Christian vivisectionist to take is to say that the superiority of man over beast is a real objective fact, guaranteed by revelation, and that the propriety of sacrificing beast to man is a logical consequence. We are worth more than many sparrows, Matthew chapter 10, verse 31. And in saying this, we are not merely expressing a natural preference for our own species simply because it is our own, but conforming to a hierarchical order created by God, and really present in the universe, whether anyone acknowledges it or not. The position may not be satisfactory. We may fail to see how a benevolent deity could wish us to draw such conclusions from the hierarchical order he has created. We may find it difficult to formulate a human right of tormenting beasts in terms which would not equally imply an angelic right of tormenting men. And we may feel that though objective superiority is rightly claimed for men, yet that very superiority ought partly to consist in not behaving like a vivisector, that we ought to prove ourselves better than the beasts precisely by the fact of acknowledging duties to them which they do not acknowledge to us. But on all these questions different opinions can be honestly held. If, on grounds of our real, divinely ordained superiority, a Christian pathologist thinks it right to vivisect, and does so with scrupulous care to avoid the least dram or scruple of unnecessary pain, in a trembling awe at the responsibility which he assumes, and with a vivid sense of the high mode in which human life must be lived, if it is to justify the sacrifices made for it, then, whether we agree with him or not, we can respect his point of view. But of course, the vast majority of vivisectors have no such theological background. They are most of them naturalistic and Darwinian. Now here, surely, we come up against a very alarming fact. The very same people who will most contemptuously brush aside any consideration of animal suffering if it stands in the way of research, will also, on another context, most vehemently deny that there is any radical difference between man and the other animals. On the naturalistic view, the beasts are, at bottom, just the same sort of things as ourselves. Man is simply the cleverest of the anthropoids. All the grounds on which a Christian might defend vivisection are thus cut from under our feet. We sacrifice other species to our own, not because our own has any objective metaphysical privilege over others, but simply because it is ours. It may be very natural to have this loyalty to our own species, but let us hear no more from the naturalists about the sentimentality of anti-vivisectionists. If loyalty to our own species, preference for man simply because we are men, is not a sentiment, then what is? It may be a good sentiment or a bad one, but a sentiment it certainly is. Try to base it on logic and see what happens. But the most sinister thing about modern vivisection is this. If a mere sentiment justifies cruelty, why stop at a sentiment for the whole human race? There is also a sentiment for the white man against the black, for a Herrenvolk against the non-Aryans, for civilized or progressive peoples against savages or backward peoples. Finally, for our own country, party or class against others. Once the old Christian idea of a total difference in kind between man and beast has been abandoned, then no argument for experiments on animals can be found, which is not also an argument for experiments on inferior men. If we cut up beasts simply because they cannot prevent us, and because we are backing our own side in the struggle for existence, it is only logical to cut up imbeciles, criminals, enemies, or capitalists for the same reasons. Indeed, experiments on men have already begun. We all hear that Nazi scientists have done them. We all suspect that our own scientists may begin to do so, in secret, at any moment. The alarming thing is that the vivisectors have won the first round. In the 19th and 18th centuries, a man was not stamped as a crank for protesting against vivisection. Lewis Carroll protested, if I remember his famous letter correctly, on the very same ground which I have just used. Dr. Johnson, a man whose mind had as much iron in it as any man's, protested in a note on Cymbeline which is worth quoting in full. In Act 1, Scene 5, the Queen explains to the doctor that she wants poisons to experiment on such creatures as we count not worth the hanging, but none human. The doctor replies, Your Highness shall from this practice but make hard your heart. Johnson comments, the thought would probably have been more amplified had our author lived to be shocked with such experiments as have been published in later times by a race of men that have practised tortures without pity and related them without shame, and are yet suffered to erect their heads among human beings. The words are his, not mine, and in truth we hardly dare in these days to use such calmly stern language. The reason why we do not dare is that the other side has, in fact, won. And though cruelty even to beasts is an important matter, their victory is symptomatic of matters more important still. The victory of vivisection marks a great advance in the triumph of ruthless, non-moral utilitarianism over the old world of ethical law. A triumph in which we, as well as animals, are already the victims, and of which Dachau and Hiroshima mark the more recent achievements. In justifying cruelty to animals, we put ourselves also on the animal level. We choose the jungle, and must abide by our choice. You will notice I have spent no time in discussing what actually goes on in the laboratories. We shall be told, of course, that there is surprisingly little cruelty. That is a question with which, at present, I have nothing to do. We must first decide what should be allowed. After that, it is for the police to discover what is already being done. Priestesses in the Church. Originally published as Notes on the Way in Time and Tide, Volume 29, 14th of August 1948, and reproduced in Undeceptions, 1971, this is now in God in the Dock, 1998. I should like balls infinitely better, said Caroline Bingley, if they were carried on in a different manner. It would surely be much more rational if conversation instead of dancing made the order of the day. Much more rational, I dare say, replied her brother, but it would not be near so much like a ball. We are told that the lady was silenced. Yet it could be maintained that Jane Austen has not allowed Bingley to put forward the full strength of his position. He ought to have replied with a distinguo. In one sense, conversation is more rational, for conversation may exercise the reason alone, dancing does not. But there is nothing irrational in exercising other powers than our reason. On certain occasions, and for certain purposes, the real irrationality is with those who will not do so. The man who would try to break a horse, or write a poem, or beget a child by pure syllogizing would be an irrational man. Though at the same time, syllogizing is in itself a more rational activity than the activities demanded by these achievements. It is rational not to reason, or not to limit oneself to reason in the wrong place. And the more rational a man is, the better he knows this. These remarks are not intended as a contribution to the criticism of Pride and Prejudice. They came into my head when I heard that the Church of England was being advised to declare women capable of priests' orders. I am, indeed, informed that such a proposal is very unlikely to be seriously considered by the authorities. To take such a revolutionary step at the present moment, to cut ourselves off from the Christian past, and to widen the divisions between ourselves and other churches by establishing an order of priestesses in our midst, would be an almost wanton degree of imprudence. And the Church of England herself would be torn in shreds by the operation. My concern with the proposal is of a more theoretical kind. The question involves something even deeper than a revolution in order. I have every respect for those who wish women to be priestesses. I think they are sincere and pious and sensible people. Indeed, in a way they are too sensible. That is where my dissent from them resembles Bingley's dissent from his sister. I am tempted to say that the proposed arrangement would make us much more rational, but not near so much like a church. For at first sight, all the rationality, in Caroline Bingley's sense, is on the side of the innovators. We are short of priests. We have discovered in one profession after another that women can do very well all sorts of things which were once supposed to be in the power of men alone. No one among those who dislike the proposal is maintaining that women are less capable than men of piety, zeal, learning, and whatever else seems necessary for the pastoral office. What then, except prejudice begotten by tradition, forbids us to draw on the huge reserves which could pour into the priesthood if women were here, as in so many other professions, put on the same footing as men? And against this flood of common sense, the opposers, many of them women, can produce, at first, nothing but an inarticulate distaste, a sense of discomfort which they themselves find it hard to analyze. That this reaction does not spring from any contempt for women is, I think, plain from history. The Middle Ages carried their reverence for one woman to a point at which the charge could plausibly be made that the Blessed Virgin became in their eyes almost a fourth person of the Trinity. But never, so far as I know, in all those ages was anything remotely resembling a sacerdotal office attributed to her. All salvation depends on the decision which she made in the words Ecce Ancilla. She is united in 9 months' inconceivable intimacy with the eternal Word. She stands at the foot of the cross, John chapter 19, verse 25. But she is absent both from the Last Supper, Matthew chapter 26, verse 26, Mark chapter 14, verse 22, Luke chapter 22, verse 19, and from the descent of the Spirit at Pentecost, Acts chapter 2, verse 1. Such is the record of Scripture. Nor can you daff it aside by saying that local and temporary conditions condemned women to silence and private life. There were female preachers. One man had 4 daughters who all prophesied, i.e., preached. Acts chapter 21, verse 9. There were prophetesses even in Old Testament times. Prophetesses, not priestesses. At this point, the common sensible reformer is apt to ask why, if women can preach, they cannot do all the rest of a priest's work. This question deepens the discomfort of my side. We begin to feel that what really divides us from our opponents is a difference between the meaning which they and we give to the word priest. The more they speak, and speak truly, about the competence of women in administration, their tact and sympathy as advisers, their natural talent for visiting, the more we feel that the central thing is being forgotten. To us, a priest is primarily a representative, a double representative, who represents us to God and God to us. Our very eyes teach us this in the Church. Sometimes the priest turns his back on us and faces the east. He speaks to God for us. Sometimes he faces us and speaks to us for God. We have no objection to a woman doing the first. The whole difficulty is about the second. But why? Why should a woman not in this sense represent God? Certainly not because she is necessarily, or even probably, less holy or less charitable or stupider than a man. In that sense she may be as godlike as a man, and a given woman much more so than a given man. The sense in which she cannot represent God will perhaps be plainer if we look at the thing the other way round. Suppose the reformer stops saying that a good woman may be like God, and begins saying that God is like a good woman. Suppose he says that we might just as well pray to Our Mother which art in heaven as to Our Father. Suppose he suggests that the Incarnation might just as well have taken a female as a male form, and the second person of the Trinity be as well called the daughter as the son. Suppose, finally, that the mystical marriage were reversed, that the Church were the bridegroom and Christ the bride. All this, as it seems to me, is involved in the claim that a woman can represent God as a priest does. And now it is surely the case that if all these supposals were ever carried into effect, we should be embarked on a different religion. Goddesses have, of course, been worshipped. Many religions have had priestesses. But they are religions quite different in character from Christianity. Common sense, disregarding the discomfort or even the horror which the idea of turning all our theological language into the feminine gender arouses in most Christians, will ask, why not? Since God is in fact not a biological being and has no sex, what can it matter whether we say he or she, father or mother, son or daughter? But Christians think that God himself has taught us how to speak of him. To say that it does not matter is to say either that all masculine imagery is not inspired, is merely human in origin, or else that, though inspired, it is quite arbitrary and unessential. And this is surely intolerable. Or, if tolerable, it is an argument not in favour of Christian priestesses, but against Christianity. It is also surely based on a shallow view of imagery. Without drawing upon religion, we know from our poetical experience that image and apprehension cleave closer together than common sense is here prepared to admit. That a child who had been taught to pray to a mother in heaven would have a religious life radically different from that of a Christian child. And as image and apprehension are in an organic unity, so, for a Christian, are human body and human soul. The innovators are really implying that sex is something superficial, irrelevant to the spiritual life. To say that men and women are equally eligible for a certain profession is to say that for the purposes of that profession their sex is irrelevant. We are, within that context, treating both as neuters. As the state grows more like a hive or an anthill, it needs an increasing number of workers who can be treated as neuters. This may be inevitable for our secular life. But in our Christian life we must return to reality. There we are not homogeneous units, but different and complementary organs of a mystical body. Lady Nunbernholm has claimed that the equality of men and women is a Christian principle. I do not remember the text in Scripture, nor the Fathers, nor Hooker, nor the Prayer Book which asserts it. But that is not here my point. The point is that unless equal means interchangeable, equality makes nothing for the priesthood of women. And the kind of equality which implies that the equals are interchangeable, like counters or identical machines, is, among humans, a legal fiction. It may be a useful legal fiction, but in church we turn our back on fictions. One of the ends for which sex was created was to symbolize to us the hidden things of God. One of the functions of human marriage is to express the nature of the union between Christ and the Church. We have no authority to take the living and seminal figures which God has painted on the canvas of our nature and shift them about as if they were mere geometrical figures. This is what common sense will call mystical. Exactly. The Church claims to be the bearer of a revelation. If that claim is false, then we want not to make priestesses, but to abolish priests. If it is true, then we would expect to find in the Church an element which unbelievers will call irrational, and which believers will call supra-rational. There ought to be something in it opaque to our reason, though not contrary to it, as the facts of sex and sense on the natural level are opaque. And that is the real issue. The Church of England can remain a church only if she retains this opaque element. If we abandon that, if we retain only what can be justified by standards of prudence and convenience at the bar of enlightened common sense, then we exchange revelation for that old wraith, natural religion. It is painful, being a man, to have to assert the privilege or the burden which Christianity lays upon my own sex. I am crushingly aware how inadequate most of us are in our actual and historical individualities to fill the place prepared for us. But it is an old saying in the army that you salute the uniform, not the wearer. Only one wearing the masculine uniform can, provisionally until the parousia, represent the Lord to the Church. For we are all, corporately and individually, feminine to him. We men may often make very bad priests. That is because we are insufficiently masculine. It is no cure to call in those who are not masculine at all. A given man may make a very bad husband. You cannot mend matters by trying to reverse the roles. He may make a bad male partner in a dance. The cure for that is that men should more diligently attend dancing classes. Not that the ballroom should henceforth ignore distinctions of sex and treat all dances as neuter. That would, of course, be eminently sensible, civilized, and enlightened, but, once more, not near so much like a ball. And this parallel between the Church and the ball is not so fanciful as some would think. The Church ought to be more like a ball than it is like a factory or a political party. Or, to speak more strictly, they are at the circumference and the Church at the centre, and the ball comes in between. The factory and the political party are artificial creations. A breath can make them as a breath has made. In them we are not dealing with human beings in their concrete entirety, only with hands or voters. I am not, of course, using artificial in any derogatory sense. Such artifices are necessary, but because they are our artifices, we are free to shuffle, scrap, and experiment as we please. But the ball exists to stylize something which is natural, and which concerns human beings in their entirety, namely courtship. We cannot shuffle or tamper so much. With the Church we are farther in, for there we are dealing with male and female not merely as facts of nature, but as the live and awful shadows of realities utterly beyond our control and largely beyond our direct knowledge. Or rather, we are not dealing with them, but, as we shall soon learn if we meddle, they are dealing with us.
Use the referral link in the description to support the channel.
We have no right to happiness. The last thing Lewis wrote before his death in November 1963, this appeared shortly afterwards in the Saturday Evening Post, 236, 21st to the 28th of December 1963, then in Undeceptions 1971, and now in God in the Dock 1998. After all, said Claire, they had a right to happiness. We were discussing something that once happened in our own neighbourhood. Mr. A had deserted Mrs. A and got his divorce in order to marry Mrs. B, who had likewise got her divorce in order to marry Mr. A. And there was certainly no doubt that Mr. A and Mrs. B were very much in love with one another. If they continued to be in love, and if nothing went wrong with their health or their income, they might reasonably expect to be very happy. It was equally clear that they were not happy with their old partners. Mrs. B had adored her husband at the outset, but then he got smashed up in the war. It was thought he had lost his virility, and it was known that he had lost his job. Life with him was no longer what Mrs. B had bargained for. Poor Mrs. A, too, she had lost her looks, and all her liveliness. It might be true, as some said, that she consumed herself by bearing his children, and nursing him through the long illness that overshadowed their earlier married life. You mustn't, by the way, imagine that A was the sort of man who nonchalantly threw a wife away like the peel of an orange he'd sucked dry. Her suicide was a terrible shock to him. We all knew this, for he told us so himself. "But what could I do?" he said. "A man has a right to happiness. I had to take my one chance when it came." I went away thinking about the concept of a right to happiness. At first, this sounds to me as odd as the right to good luck. For I believe, whatever one school of moralists may say, that we depend for a very great deal of our happiness or misery on circumstances outside all human control. A right to happiness doesn't, for me, make much more sense than a right to be 6 feet tall, or to have a millionaire for your father, or to get good weather whenever you want to have a picnic. I can understand a right as a freedom guaranteed me by the laws of the society I live in. Thus, I have a right to travel along the public roads because society gives me that freedom. That's what we mean by calling the roads public. I can also understand a right as a claim guaranteed me by the laws, and a correlative to an obligation on someone else's part. If I have a right to receive £100 from you, this is another way of saying that you have a duty to pay me £100. If the laws allow Mr. A to desert his wife and seduce his neighbour's wife, then, by definition, Mr. A has a legal right to do so, and we need bring in no talk about happiness. But, of course, that was not what Claire meant. She meant that he had not only a legal, but a moral right to act as he did. In other words, Claire is, or would be if she thought it out, a classical moralist after the style of Thomas Aquinas, Grotius, Hooker and Locke. She believes that behind the laws of the state there is a natural law. I agree with her. I hold this conception to be basic to all civilization. Without it, the actual laws of the state become an absolute, as in Hegel. They cannot be criticized because there is no norm against which they should be judged. The ancestry of Claire's maxim, "They have a right to happiness," is august. In words that are cherished by all civilized men, but especially by Americans, it has been laid down that one of the rights of man is a right to the pursuit of happiness. And now we get to the real point. What did the writers of that august declaration mean? It is quite certain what they did not mean. They did not mean that man was entitled to pursue happiness by any and every means, including, say, murder, rape, robbery, treason, and fraud. No society could be built on such a basis. They meant to pursue happiness by all lawful means, that is, by all means which the law of nature eternally sanctions, and which the laws of the nation shall sanction. Admittedly, this seems at first to reduce their maxim to the tautology that men, in pursuit of happiness, have a right to do whatever they have a right to do. But tautologies, seen against their proper historical context, are not always barren tautologies. The declaration is primarily a denial of the political principles which long governed Europe, a challenge flung down to the Austrian and Russian empires, to England before the Reform Bills, to Bourbon France. It demands that whatever means of pursuing happiness are lawful for any should be lawful for all, that man, not men of some particular caste, class, status, or religion, should be free to use them. In a century when this is being unsaid by nation after nation and party after party, let us not call it a barren tautology. But the question as to what means are lawful, what methods of pursuing happiness are either morally permissible by the law of nature, or should be declared legally permissible by the legislature of a particular nation, remains exactly where it did. And on that question I disagree with Clare. I don't think it is obvious that people have the unlimited right to happiness which she suggests. For one thing, I believe that Clare, when she says happiness, means simply and solely sexual happiness, partly because women like Clare never use the word happiness in any other sense, but also because I never heard Clare talk about the right to any other kind. She was rather leftist in her politics, and would have been scandalized if anyone had defended the actions of a ruthless man-eating tycoon on the ground that his happiness consisted in making money, and he was pursuing his happiness. She was also a rabid teetotaler. I never heard her excuse an alcoholic because he was happy when he was drunk. A good many of Clare's friends, and especially her female friends, often felt, I've heard them say so, that their own happiness would be perceptibly increased by boxing her ears. I very much doubt if this would have brought her theory of a right to happiness into play. Clare, in fact, is doing what the whole Western world seems to me to have been doing for the last 40-odd years. When I was a youngster, all the progressive people were saying, "Why all this prudery? Let us treat sex just as we treat all our other impulses." I was simple-minded enough to believe they meant what they said. I have since discovered that they meant exactly the opposite. They meant that sex was to be treated as no other impulse in our nature has ever been treated by civilized people. All the others, we admit, have to be bridled. Absolute obedience to your instinct for self-preservation is what we call cowardice. To your acquisitive impulse, avarice. Even sleep must be resisted if you're a sentry. But every unkindness and breach of faith seems to be condoned, provided that the object aimed at is 4 bare legs in a bed. It is like having a morality in which stealing fruit is considered wrong, unless you steal nectarines. And if you protest against this view, you are usually met with chatter about the legitimacy and beauty and sanctity of sex, and accused of harbouring some Puritan prejudice against it as something disreputable or shameful. I deny the charge. A foam-born Venus, golden Aphrodite, Our Lady of Cyprus, I never breathed a word against you. If I object to boys who steal my nectarines, must I be supposed to disapprove of nectarines in general, or even of boys in general? It might, you know, be stealing that I disapproved of. The real situation is skilfully concealed by saying that the question of Mr. A's right to desert his wife is one of sexual morality. Robbing an orchard is not an offence against some special morality called fruit morality. It is an offence against honesty. Mr. A's action is an offence against good faith, to solemn promises, against gratitude towards one to whom he was deeply indebted, and against common humanity. Our sexual impulses are thus being put in the position of preposterous privilege. The sexual motive is taken to condone all sorts of behaviour which, if it had any other end in view, would be condemned as merciless, treacherous, and unjust. And now, though I see no good reason for giving sex this privilege, I think I see a strong cause. It is this. It is part of the nature of a strong erotic passion, as distinct from a transient fit of appetite, that it makes more towering promises than any other emotion. No doubt all our desires make promises, but not so impressively. To be in love involves the almost irresistible conviction that one will go on being in love until one dies, and that possession of the beloved will confer not merely frequent ecstasies, but settled, fruitful, deep-rooted, lifelong happiness. Hence all seems to be at stake. If we miss this chance, we shall have lived in vain. At the very thought of such doom, we sink into fathomless depths of self-pity. Unfortunately, these promises are found often to be quite untrue. Every experienced adult knows this to be so as regards all erotic passions, except the one he himself is feeling at the moment. We discount the world without end pretensions of our friends' amours easily enough. We know that such things sometimes last and sometimes don't. And when they do last, this is not because they promised at the outset to do so. When two people achieve lasting happiness, this is not solely because they are great lovers, but because they are also, I must put it crudely, good people, controlled, loyal, fair-minded, mutually adaptable people. If we establish a right to sexual happiness which supersedes all the ordinary rules of behaviour, we do so not because of what our passion shows itself to be in experience, but because of what it professes to be while we are in the grip of it. Hence, while the bad behaviour is real and works miseries and degradations, the happiness which was the object of the behaviour turns out again and again to be illusory. Everyone, except Mr. A and Mrs. B, knows that Mr. A in a year or so may have the same reason for deserting his new wife as for deserting his old. He will feel again that all is at stake. He will see himself again as the great lover, and his pity for himself will exclude all pity for the woman. Two further points remain. One is this. A society in which conjugal infidelity is tolerated must always be, in the long run, a society adverse to women. Women, whatever a few male songs and satires may say to the contrary, are more naturally monogamous than men. It is a biological necessity. Where promiscuity prevails, they will therefore always be more often the victims than the culprits. Also, domestic happiness is more necessary to them than to us. And the quality by which they most easily hold a man, their beauty, decreases every year after they have come to maturity. But this does not happen to those qualities of personality, women don't really care twopence about our looks, by which we hold women. Thus, in the ruthless war of promiscuity, women are at a double disadvantage. They play for higher stakes and are also more likely to lose. I have no sympathy with moralists who frown at the increasing crudity of female provocativeness. These signs of desperate competition fill me with pity. Secondly, though the right to happiness is chiefly claimed for the sexual impulse, it seems to me impossible that the matter should stay there. The fatal principle, once allowed in that department, must sooner or later seep through our whole lives. We thus advance towards a state of society in which not only each man, but every impulse in each man claims carte blanche. And then, though our technological skill may help us survive a little longer, our civilization will have died at the heart, and will, one dare not even add, unfortunately, be swept away.
Use the referral link in the description to support the channel.
Christian Reunion. An Anglican speaks to Roman Catholics. Written at the invitation of Roman Catholic friends, this essay was discovered on the back of a few sheets of broadcasts made in 1944 after Lewis's death in 1963, and was published for the first time in Christian Reunion 1990. I have been asked to write on Christian Reunion but I am afraid that what I have to say will amount to little more than a rough analysis of the actual disunity and a suggestion of how most of us ought to behave while our tragic and sinful divisions continue. I will begin by saying that, whether for good or ill, the nature of the disunity has changed with the centuries. It has become more strictly or clearly theological. I have been well placed for noticing this because I grew up in a very archaic society, that of Northern Ireland, amidst conditions which had even then long since passed away in England. I have thus had a glimpse of the old disunity, the kind that descended from the 16th century. In it, the strictly theological differences were hopelessly entangled with differences of nationality, class, politics, and the less essential differences of ritual. I do not suggest that all differences of ritual are unessential. They were also very embittered. A Protestant mother whose son turned from atheism to Rome, or a Roman mother whose son turned from atheism to Protestantism, would both have felt, I think, simple grief. That state of affairs has passed away. On the question of ritual, indeed, it has almost turned upside down. In southern England, the Romans are now not ritualistic enough to please the High Anglicans, and the Congregationalists may, I am told, be as high as either. Whatever the barrier now is, it is no longer a barrier of candles. Whatever the fog, it is not a fog of incense. And on the purely theological level, I think I may say that the barrier is no longer that between a doctrine of faith and a doctrine of works. I am not myself convinced that any good Roman ever did hold the doctrine of works in that form of which Protestants accused him, or that any good Protestant ever did hold the doctrine of faith in that form of which the Romans accused him. At any rate, I feel certain that no man of good will today hopes to see God either by pecca fortiter or by founding an abbey. It would still be difficult, especially in Germany, to get an agreed formula. But I think that difficulty now springs rather from the mysteriousness of the subject itself than from two clearly held and mutually exclusive doctrines. The difficulty that remains, and which becomes sharper as it becomes narrower, is our disagreement about the seat and nature of doctrinal authority. The real reason, I take it, why you cannot be in communion with us is not your disagreement with this or that particular Protestant doctrine, so much as the absence of any real doctrine, in your sense of the word, at all. It is, you feel, like asking a man to say he agrees not with a speaker, but with a debating society. And the real reason why I cannot be in communion with you is not my disagreement with this or that Roman doctrine, but that to accept your church means not to accept a given body of doctrine, but to accept in advance any doctrine your church hereafter produces. It is like being asked to agree not only to what a man has said, but to what he's going to say. To you, the real vice of Protestantism is the formless drift which seems unable to retain the Catholic truths, which loses them one by one and ends in a modernism which cannot be classified as Christian by any tolerable stretch of the word. To us, the terrible thing about Rome is the recklessness, as we hold, with which she has added to the depositum fidei, the tropical fertility, the proliferation of credenda. You see in Protestantism the faith dying out in a desert. We see in Rome the faith smothered in a jungle. I know no way of bridging this gulf, nor do I think it the business of the private layman to offer much advice on bridge building to his betters. My only function as a Christian writer is to preach mere Christianity, not ad clerum, but ad populum. Any success that has been given me has, I believe, been due to my strict observance of those limits. By attempting to do otherwise, I should only add one more recruit, and a very ill-qualified recruit, to the ranks of the controversialists. After that, I should be no more use to anyone. I have, however, a strong premonition as to the way in which reunion will not come. It will not come at the edges. Liberal Romans and High Anglicans will not be the ones who will meet first. For the odd thing is that the nearer you get to the heart of each communion, the less you notice its difference from the other. It is important at this point that I should not be misunderstood. What I am trying to say might be interpreted to mean that doctrines don't matter, and that the essence of the spiritual life lay either in the affections or in some mystical experience to which the intelligence is simply irrelevant. I do not believe it is so. That the spiritual life transcends both intelligence and morality, we are probably all agreed. But I suppose it transcends them as poetry transcends grammar, and does not merely exclude them as algebra excludes grammar. I should distrust a mysticism to which they ever became simply irrelevant. That is not the way in which the divisions grow less important at the centre. To the very last, when two people differ in doctrine, logic proclaims that though both might be in error, it is impossible for both to be right. And error always, to some extent, disables. When, therefore, we find a certain heavenly unity existing between really devout persons of differing creeds, a mutual understanding, and even a power of mutual edification which each may lack towards a lukewarm member of his own denomination, we must ascribe this to the work of Christ, who, in the erroneous one, sterilizes his errors and inhibits the evil consequences they would naturally have. If ye drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt you, Mark chapter 16, verse 18, and opens the eyes of the other party to all the truths mingled in his friend's errors, which are, of course, likely to be truths he particularly needs.
Use the referral link in the description to support the channel.
51. A Slip of the Tongue. An enlarged version of Thoughts of a Cambridge Don, this was published in The Lion, the magazine of St. Mark's, Dundela, Belfast, January 1963. It was also preached as a sermon in Magdalen College Chapel, Cambridge in 1956. First published in They Asked for a Paper, 1962, it is now in Screwtape Proposes a Toast, 1998. When a layman has to preach a sermon, I think he is most likely to be useful, or even interesting, if he starts exactly from where he is himself, not so much presuming to instruct as comparing notes. Not long ago, when I was using the collect for the fourth Sunday after Trinity and my private prayers, I found that I had made a slip of the tongue. I had meant to pray that I might so pass through things temporal that I finally lost not the things eternal. I found I had prayed so to pass through things eternal that I finally lost not the things temporal. Of course, I don't think that a slip of the tongue is a sin. I am not sure that I am even a strict enough Freudian to believe that all such slips, without exception, are deeply significant. But I think some of them are significant, and I thought this was one of that sort. I thought that what I had inadvertently said very nearly expressed something I had really wished. Very nearly. Not, of course, precisely. I had never been quite stupid enough to think that the eternal could strictly be passed through. What I had wanted to pass through without prejudice to my things temporal was those hours or moments in which I attended to the eternal, in which I exposed myself to it. I mean this sort of thing. I say my prayers, I read a book of devotion, I prepare for or receive the sacrament. But while I do these things, there is, so to speak, a voice inside me that urges caution. It tells me to be careful, to keep my head, not to go too far, not to burn my boats. I come into the presence of God with a great fear, lest anything should happen to me within that presence which will prove too intolerably inconvenient when I have come out again into my ordinary life. I don't want to be carried away into any resolution which I shall afterwards regret, for I know I shall be feeling quite different after breakfast. I don't want anything to happen to me at the altar which will run up too big a bill to pay then. It would be very disagreeable, for instance, to take the duty of charity, while I am at the altar, so seriously that, after breakfast, I had to tear up the really stunning reply I had written to an impudent correspondent yesterday and meant to post today. It would be very tiresome to commit myself to a program of temperance, which would cut off my after-breakfast cigarette, or, at best, make it cruelly alternative to a cigarette later in the morning. Even repentance of past acts will have to be paid for. By repenting, one acknowledges them as sins, therefore not to be repeated. Better leave that issue undecided. The root principle of all these precautions is the same. to guard the things temporal. And I find some evidence that this temptation is not peculiar to me. A good author, whose name I have forgotten, asks somewhere, "Have we never risen from our knees in haste, for fear God's will should become too unmistakable if we prayed longer?" The following story was told as true. An Irish woman who had just been at confession met on the steps of the chapel the other woman who was her greatest enemy in the village. The other woman let fly a torrent of abuse. "Isn't it a shame for ye," replied Biddy, "to be talking to me like that, you coward, and me in a state of grace, the way I can't answer ye? But you wait. I won't be in a state of grace long." There is an excellent tragicomic example in Trollope's last chronicle. The archdeacon was angry with his eldest son. He had once made a number of legal arrangements to the son's disadvantage. They could all easily have been made a few days later, but Trollope explains why the archdeacon would not wait. To reach the next day, he had to pass through his evening prayers, and he knew that he might not be able to carry his hostile plan safely through the clause, "Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive." So he got in first. He decided to present God with a fait accompli. This is an extreme case of the precautions I am talking about. The man will not venture within reach of the eternal until he has made the things temporal safe in advance. This is my endlessly recurrent temptation, to go down to that sea, I think St. John of the Cross called God a sea, and there neither dive nor swim nor float, but only dabble and splash, careful not to get out of my depth, and holding on to the lifeline which connects me with my things temporal. It is different from the temptations that met us at the beginning of the Christian life. Then we fought, at least I fought, against admitting the claims of the eternal at all. And when we had fought and been beaten and surrendered, we supposed that all would be fairly plain sailing. This temptation comes later. It is addressed to those who have already admitted the claim in principle and are even making some sort of effort to meet it. Our temptation is to look eagerly for the minimum that will be accepted. We are in fact like very honest but reluctant taxpayers. We approve of an income tax in principle. We make our returns truthfully, but we dread a rise in the tax. We are very careful to pay no more than is necessary. And we very ardently hope, that after we have paid it, there will still be enough left to live on. And notice that those cautions which the tempter whispers in our ears are all plausible. Indeed, I don't think he often tries to deceive us, after early youth, with a direct lie. The plausibility is this: it is really possible to be carried away by religious emotion, enthusiasm, as our ancestors called it, into resolutions and attitudes which we shall, not sinfully but rationally, not when we are more worldly, but when we are wiser, have cause to regret. We can become scrupulous or fanatical. We can, in what seems zeal but is really presumption, embrace tasks never intended for us. That is the truth in the temptation. The lie consists in the suggestion that our best protection is a prudent regard for the safety of our pocket, our habitual indulgences, and our ambitions. But that is quite false. Our real protection is to be sought elsewhere, in common Christian usage, in moral theology, in steady rational thinking, in the advice of good friends and good books, and, if need be, in a skilled spiritual director. Swimming lessons are better than a lifeline to the shore. For of course, that lifeline is really a death line. There is no parallel to paying taxes and living on the remainder. For it is not so much of our time and so much of our attention that God demands. It is not even all our time and all our attention. It is ourselves. For each of us, the Baptist's words are true. He must increase and I decrease. He will be infinitely merciful to our repeated failures. I know no promise that he will accept a deliberate compromise. For he has, in the last resort, nothing to give us but himself. And he can give that only in so far as our self-affirming will retires and makes room for him in our souls. Let us make up our minds to it. There will be nothing of our own left over to live on, no ordinary life. I do not mean that each of us will necessarily be called to be a martyr, or even an ascetic. That's as may be. For some, Nobody knows which. The Christian life will include much leisure, many occupations we naturally like. But these will be received from God's hands. In a perfect Christian, they would be as much part of his religion, his service, as his hardest duties, and his feasts would be as Christian as his fasts. What cannot be admitted, what must exist only as an undefeated but daily resisted enemy, is the idea of something that is our own, some area in which we are to be out of school, on which God has no claim. For he claims all, because he is love and must bless. He cannot bless us unless he has us. When we try to keep within us an area that is our own, we try to keep an area of death. Therefore, in love, he claims all. There's no bargaining with him. This is, I take it, the meaning of all those sayings that alarm me most. Thomas More said, "If ye make indentures with God how much ye will serve him, ye shall find ye have signed both of them yourself." Law, in his terrible cool voice, said, "Many will be rejected at the last day, not because they have taken no time or pains about their salvation, but because they have not taken time and pains enough." And later, in his richer Baimonite period, "If you have not chosen the kingdom of God, it will make in the end no difference what you have chosen instead." Those are hard words to take. Will it really make no difference whether it was women or patriotism, cocaine or art, whiskey or a seat in the cabinet, money or science? Well, surely no difference that matters. We shall have missed the end for which we are formed, and rejected the only thing that satisfies. Does it matter to a man dying in a desert, by which choice of route he missed the only well? It is a remarkable fact that on this subject heaven and hell speak with one voice. The tempter tells me, "Take care. Think how much this good resolve, the acceptance of this grace, is going to cost." But our Lord equally tells us to count the cost. Even in human affairs, great importance is attached to the agreement of those whose testimony hardly ever agrees. Here, more. Between them, it would seem to be pretty clear that paddling is of little consequence. What matters, what heaven desires and hell fears, is precisely that further step. Out of our depth, out of our own control. And yet I am not in despair. At this point I become what some would call very evangelical, at any rate very un-Pelagian. I do not think any efforts of my own will can end once and for all this craving for limited liabilities, this fatal reservation. Only God can. I have good faith and hope he will. Of course, I don't mean that I can therefore, as they say, sit back. What God does for us, he does in us. The process of doing it will appear to me, and not falsely, to be the daily or hourly repeated exercises of my own will in renouncing this attitude, especially each morning, for it grows all over me like a new shell each night. Failures will be forgiven. It is acquiescence that is fatal, the permitted, regularized presence of an area in ourselves which we still claim for our own. We may never, this side of death, drive the invader out of our territory, but we must be in the resistance, not in the Vichy government. And this, so far as I can yet see, must be begun again every day. Our morning prayer should be that in the Imitation, Da hodie perfecte incipere. Grant me to make an unflawed beginning today, for I have done nothing yet.
Use the referral link in the description to support the channel.